Have you ever noticed how some people stay completely relaxed about money, no matter what the economy is doing? They don't flinch when prices climb, when the stock market dips, or when a surprise bill lands in the mailbox. And why is it that some retirees feel totally at ease, while others spend years quietly worrying whether their savings will hold up? Picture two neighbors, Daniel and Ryan. Both worked hard for more than 4 decades. Both earned roughly the same salary. Both dreamed of a comfortable retirement. Today, Daniel spends his afternoons with his grandkids, tends to his garden, and barely thinks about money at all. Ryan, on the other hand, sits at his kitchen table some nights, staring at his account balance, asking himself a question he never thought he'd have to ask. Is my money going to run out? That's a frightening question to face, not just because of the numbers involved, because of what it does to your peace of mind. It affects your sleep. It affects how you picture your own future. Most people assume the gap between these two men is easy to explain. Maybe one earned more. Maybe one picked better investments. Maybe one just got lucky. But the real answer is far more unexpected. The biggest danger to financial security usually isn't inflation. It isn't a recession. It isn't even a modest paycheck. The real danger is a habit that feels completely ordinary while you're living your life. A habit so common that millions of people follow it without ever stopping to question it. At first, it seems harmless. It might even feel like progress. But slowly, quietly, it reshapes your entire financial future. And the strangest part? Most people don't notice what's happening until years have already passed. By then, they've stopped asking how to get rich. They're only asking how to feel safe again. So, what actually separated Daniel and Ryan? What turned two nearly identical lives into two completely different outcomes? By the end of this video, you'll understand the simple money principles that made all the difference, and one of them is being ignored by more people than you'd expect. So again, what was the real difference between them? Was it investing skill? No. Was it luck? No. Was it some secret strategy only the wealthy know about? Not even close. What's surprising is that the habit that shaped their futures doesn't look impressive at all. Nobody brags about it. Nobody posts about it online. And yet it quietly influences nearly every financial choice a person makes. Daniel followed this habit almost without thinking. Ryan ignored it for years. In the beginning, their lives looked nearly the same. Similar cars, similar houses, similar vacations. But slowly, a gap began to form. Not a gap in income, a gap in freedom. When the furnace broke, Daniel replaced it and moved on with his week. When the market dropped, he stayed calm. When a surprise expense showed up, he barely lost any sleep. Ryan, meanwhile, felt the pressure every single time. Here's the strange part. This gap wasn't created by one dramatic decision. It was built from hundreds of small, seemingly harmless choices made over the years. That's exactly why so many people never see it coming. We're taught that financial security comes from adding more income, more investments, more possessions, more upgrades. But what if that's backwards? What if the people who always seem to have enough money aren't constantly adding things to their lives? What if they're quietly removing things instead? Because the idea at the heart of this video sounds almost too simple. Always have money. Live well with less. Most people hear that and assume the two ideas can't coexist. But by the time this video ends, you'll see just how deeply connected they really are. Here's something that doesn't quite add up, though. If financial stability really is this simple, why do so many people miss it? Why do people earning 6 figures still stress about money? Why do some retirees feel completely secure while others worry over every small expense? Why do so many people reach their later years wishing they'd done things differently? The answer isn't what most people assume. People who struggle financially rarely make one enormous mistake. That's actually what makes this so dangerous. Almost nobody sets out to trap themselves financially. Nobody wakes up and thinks, I'd like to make my future harder. Instead, they make one reasonable decision after another. A slightly nicer car, a slightly bigger house, a few payments that feel manageable, a handful of subscriptions nobody really notices, a vacation that feels well-earned, a purchase that feels deserved. Each choice makes sense on its own. That's exactly why almost nobody spots the danger. The problem only becomes visible years down the road. That's precisely what happened with Daniel and Ryan. At 40, their lives looked nearly identical. At 50, still similar. Even heading into retirement, most people would have guessed they were in the same financial shape. They weren't, because one invisible number had been quietly widening between them for decades. A number almost nobody tracks. A number that matters more than income ever could. And by the time that number finally surfaced, their futures looked nothing alike. One man had gained something money alone can't buy. The other had slowly lost it. We'll get to that number shortly. But first, something even more surprising. The biggest threat to financial stability usually isn't overspending. Most people already know overspending is risky. The real threat is something that feels responsible while you're doing it, something millions of people mistake for progress. If you'd met these two men at 40, you'd have assumed they were heading toward the same future. They weren't, because every raise affected them in completely different ways. For Daniel, every raise made life a little more secure. For Ryan, every raise quietly raised the amount of money he needed just to get through the month. At first, the difference was invisible. Then life happened. A health scare, a family emergency, an unexpected repair. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, just the ordinary things that eventually happen to everyone. And that's when the gap between them became impossible to ignore. One of them had room to adapt. The other didn't. One could absorb a surprise. The other depended on everything going exactly according to plan. Here's the twist. The hidden number separating them wasn't income. It wasn't net worth. It wasn't investment returns. It was something far simpler. The gap between what they earned and what they actually needed. Over the decades, that single gap changed everything. People assumed Ryan was the wealthier one. His lifestyle certainly looked that way. But his bank account told a different story. Because wealth isn't measured by how much you spend. It's measured by how much pressure your life places on your money. Daniel understood something most people overlook. The goal was never to own more. The goal was to need less. That one idea became one of the biggest reasons he stayed financially steady while so many others struggled. But here's what makes this even more interesting. Understanding this gap doesn't automatically solve the problem. There's another reason people lose financial footing, and it has nothing to do with income. Now, for the part that surprises most people, the real problem isn't spending, and it's not even overspending. The real problem is converting temporary income into permanent expenses. Think about it. A raise feels amazing. A bonus feels amazing. A great year at work feels amazing. But what do most people do next? They take on new commitments, a bigger house, a newer car, a higher monthly payment, something that has to be paid again next month, and the month after that, and the month after that. The strange part is that the extra income that triggered those decisions might not last, but the commitments almost always do. That's why two people can get the exact same raise and end up in totally different situations years later. Daniel treated extra income as a bonus. Ryan treated it as permission. Permission to make life a little more expensive. At first, both choices felt good. Years later, one choice created security. The other created dependence. That's the hidden trap. Most people think they're buying a better lifestyle. What they're really buying is a higher minimum cost of living, and once that number starts climbing, it almost never comes back down. Financial stability isn't really about how much money comes in. It's about how much money your life demands before the month even begins. Every raise gave Daniel more options. Every raise gave Ryan more obligations. One life became harder to break apart. The other became harder to keep supporting. And that difference would shape everything that came next. Here's what most people never realize. Financial stability isn't created by income. It's created by margin, the space between what you earn and what your life requires. That space doesn't sound exciting. Nobody brags about it. Nobody posts about it online. But it quietly determines how much control you have over your own future. At 45, the difference between Daniel and Ryan was still almost invisible. Both looked successful. Both paid their bills on time. Both seemed to be doing just fine. But one number was moving in opposite directions for each of them. Daniel's margin was slowly growing. Ryan's was slowly shrinking. Neither of them noticed at first. Then life started happening. A health issue, a relative who needed support, an unexpected repair, a shift in priorities. Nothing dramatic, just real life. And that's when the value of margin became obvious. Margin creates breathing room. Most people track their income. Some track their savings. Very few track their breathing room, yet it's often the exact thing that separates a setback from a full-blown crisis. With breathing room, a surprise expense is annoying. Without it, that same expense can feel like a disaster. That's why Daniel stayed calm, not because he was richer, but because he had room to move, room to think, room to adjust. Ryan had less of that room every single year, not because he made terrible choices, but because every new commitment quietly chipped away at his ability to adapt. And then something even more interesting happened. Over time, the things Ryan once merely wanted started to feel necessary. That's the moment most people miss. At first you ask, do I want this? Later, without even noticing, the question shifts to, how could I possibly live without it? That's the moment a lifestyle becomes part of your identity. The purchase stops being something you own and turns into something you feel you need. By 55, the gap between them was growing. By 65, it was undeniable. One man had choices, the other had obligations. And if life teaches one lesson over and over, it's this: things rarely go according to plan forever. Financial stability was never about having the highest income. It was about protecting enough breathing room to handle whatever life throws at you next. Now, most people believe financial stability comes from hitting a specific number, maybe $50,000 saved, maybe $100,000, maybe a full million. The assumption is simple: bigger number, bigger safety. But here's something most people never stop to consider. A dollar figure by itself tells you almost nothing. Imagine Daniel and Ryan both have exactly $100,000 saved. Same amount, same age, same stage in life. On paper, they look equally secure. They're not. Daniel could live on that money for several years. Ryan could barely stretch it through a few months. Same savings, completely different reality. That's because financial stability isn't measured by how much money you have. It's measured by how much time that money can buy you. Most people spend years chasing a number. Very few stop to ask what that number is actually for. Money itself was never the real goal. What money buys is time. Time to recover from mistakes. Time to absorb surprises. Time to make better decisions. Time to adjust when life shifts underneath you. Which brings us to one of the most important ideas in this whole video: resilience. Most people think resilience is a personality trait. It isn't. In personal finance, resilience is a number. A simple one. If your income vanished tomorrow, how long could your current lifestyle keep going? 3 months? 6 months? A year? 5 years? That's resilience. And whether people realize it or not, they're building or shrinking that number every single day. A person with high resilience runs into a problem. A person with low resilience runs into a crisis. Same event, completely different outcome. That's why financial stability was never really about having more money than the next person. It's about having more time, more options, and more ability to adapt when life doesn't cooperate. Once you start thinking of money as stored time, something shifts. You stop judging financial decisions by how they make you feel today and start judging them by what they allow you to do tomorrow. That sounds simple, but it completely changes how you approach spending. Picture two people who get the exact same raise. One uses the extra money to buy a flashy new SUV. The other uses it to pay off a monthly bill for good. 5 years later, the first person has a nicer vehicle. The second person has more choices. That's the difference most people never notice. One decision upgraded a lifestyle. The other upgraded a future. Neither one looked dramatic in the moment, but years later, the results were impossible to miss. Every financial decision does more than move numbers around in your bank account. It changes your options. That's why one of the most important lessons in personal finance is this: every purchase has 2 price tags. The first is the money you spend. The second is the freedom you give up. Most people only notice the first one. Financially secure people learn to notice both. Before making a big decision, they ask a different question: Not, can I afford this? But what will this actually cost me 5 years from now? That's a much harder question to answer, and usually a far more useful one. Daniel understood this instinctively. He wasn't trying to own the most things. He was trying to keep the most options open because wealth was never measured by what you can buy. It's measured by what you can walk away from. Someone who needs a huge income just to maintain their lifestyle might look successful, but they're often far more dependent than they realize. Meanwhile, someone living comfortably below their means might look completely ordinary, yet they usually hold something far more valuable: the ability to choose, the ability to adapt, the ability to say no. That's exactly why the wealthiest person in the room isn't always the one earning the most. Quite often, it's the one who needs the least. At this point, you might be wondering, if financial stability rests on such simple ideas, why do so many people still lose their grip on it? Why do smart, capable people keep making choices that create stress down the road? The answer has very little to do with intelligence and a lot to do with comparison. Not the obvious kind, the quiet kind. The kind that happens every single day without you even noticing. The person your age on social media who seems to be doing better. The friend posting vacation photos. The coworker celebrating a promotion. The retired couple traveling somewhere new every month. Most of us think we're simply observing all of this, but really, we're quietly adjusting our own definition of normal. And that's exactly where the trouble starts, because comparison doesn't just make you want more, it changes what feels like enough. The problem was never wanting a bigger house. The problem is that after seeing enough bigger houses, your own starts to feel small. The problem was never wanting a nicer car. The problem is that after seeing enough nicer cars, your own starts to feel outdated. Nothing about your actual life changed, but your expectations did. And expectations can get expensive fast. That brings us to one of the most important truths in personal finance. Normal is often expensive, far more expensive than most people ever realize. Ryan wasn't trying to impress anyone. He simply adjusted his expectations every time he noticed someone else doing a little better, a little bigger, a little newer, a little more impressive. Without realizing it, the finish line kept moving, and every time it moved, his spending moved right along with it. Daniel was different. He refused to let other people define what enough meant for him. Because most people set an income goal, very few ever set an enough goal. And if you don't define enough for yourself, someone else will define it for you. Ads will define it. Social media will define it. Strangers will define it. The result is almost always the same. The target keeps moving, and a person without a clear definition of enough can spend an entire lifetime chasing more. By now, you may have noticed something. Daniel and Ryan were never really playing the same game. It looked that way from the outside, but they were keeping score in completely different ways, and that difference changed everything. Most people use income as their financial scoreboard. The bigger the paycheck, the more successful they feel. The bigger the raise, the more progress they think they're making. But financially secure people usually track a different number entirely: the gap, the space between what comes in and what goes back out. A paycheck tells you how much you earn. The gap tells you how much freedom you're actually building. Consider two people. One earns $75,000 a year and manages to keep $15,000 of it. Another earns $150,000 and keeps only $5,000. Who's actually building more financial stability? Most people instantly focus on the income, but income was never the whole story. The real story is what's left over after the spending stops. That's why the gap is such a powerful number to track. It tells you whether your financial life is getting stronger or weaker. Every year the gap grows, stability grows with it. Every year it shrinks, pressure usually grows instead. Daniel eventually stopped seeing raises as extra spending power and started seeing them as opportunities to build freedom. A raise wasn't an invitation to spend more. It was a chance to widen the gap, create more breathing room, buy more time. Ryan saw raises differently. To him, a raise simply meant life could get a little bigger. The raise disappeared. The new expenses stayed. One man used higher income to increase his freedom. The other used it to increase his obligations. Which brings us to one of the most important lessons in this entire video. A raise changes your paycheck. A gap changes your future. Income creates opportunities. Margin is what keeps them alive. And that's exactly what makes the final trap so dangerous. It rarely shows up when people are struggling. It usually shows up right when they're finally doing well.